Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices. Our hostess for today's program is Teresa Miller, Executive Director for the Oklahoma Center for Poets and Writers at OSU Tulsa.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is Carlos Eire. Carlos wrote Waiting for Snow in Havana, which is winner of the National Book Award for Memoir. Thank you so much for being here, Carlos.
Thanks for inviting me to join you.
This is a beautiful book. It passes the jealousy test. I wish I'd written it. I think I told you I was writing a memoir, and after I read yours, I thought I'm going to put mine away because this is too darn good. But in your prologue, you say this is not a work of fiction, but you wish it were. Why did you not take the out that so many writers do and do an autobiographical novel?
Well, that's what I did, but in the editing process, I actually I sold it as a novel.
Oh,
and
you did?
Yes, on the manuscript title page it said in font just as large as the title, a novel. But in the editing process, my editor kept asking me, because everything seemed a shock and a revelation to her, could something like this really happen? Or did things like this really happen to people you knew in Cuba and so on and so forth? And every time I answered yes, and stupidly, sometimes I added, yes, that's exactly what happened. I'm describing what really happened. I'm not making it up. She finally asked, well, how much of this is fiction and how much is fact? And I had to admit, everything was fact. There was nothing made up here, except for maybe dialogue, right? Reconstructing dialogue. So she said, we can't publish this as fiction. It would be wrong. And then she added, it would also be foolish, because what you reveal in here is so important. It will have a much greater impact on readers if they don't have to ask these questions I've been asking you. Could this really happen? If it is an eyewitness account, it will have a much greater impact on the reader, which is what I would hope, and any author would hope, is that their work actually touches the reader and enlightens them in some way. So I very reluctantly agreed. I asked for a pen name.
Oh, no kidding.
Oh, yeah. I said, that was my first response. Fine, I'll do it, but let me write it under a pen name. And they said, no, then you can't do publicity. So, I would have to be here with a bag over my head, basically, talking to you, incognito.
Well, we could have done that, but this is
right,
a lot
this
more,
is better, yeah.
more fun. This prologue reads like a prose poem, and so many writers just give those short shrift and go through, but this is just eloquently written. And I wanted you to elaborate on another compelling observation you make, that memories are our most potent truth.
Yes, definitely. And this is something that, as a historian, you see, I had always thanked those who left me their records from 500, 600, 400 years ago. Sometimes I'm not ashamed to say, while I was reading first-person accounts, I thank these dead people. Because nothing gets you to the past more immediately than someone's eyewitness account or memory. I would also thank these people and say, I can't fully trust you. Because although memory is an instant passage to the past, you're going through someone's mind, and everyone remembers things in a very peculiar way. And there's also a difference between someone who self-consciously writes an autobiography or memoir and someone who does what I did, which was to write a novel, right, and pretend that it was fiction. I spared myself the temptation of making myself look better.
What a nice insight into that. Before you wrote this book, you're professor of history and religion at Yale University, and in that capacity you've written many, many books in the field. And I just wonder if there are certain times in life when these memories, these potent truths, are more powerful than others.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, and sometimes all it takes is one word or an image described in a sentence. And I think one of the reasons that I went into 16th and 17th century history, it's a very turbulent time of rapid change, is that I could identify with that from my own memories. I lived through a revolution. And what I study is the Reformation period. The Reformation was a revolution. And some argue that it's perhaps the first modern revolution. So there are many things I understand sort of a gut level rather than the intellectual level. And one of the subjects I've studied is iconoclasm, the destruction of religious images, something I witnessed as a child and had an immense impact on me. To hear hammers hammering away at what you think is sacred leaves a very deep scar.
Which brings up an important point. So much of your early history is the history of your native country, Cuba, and I wondered if you could give us a sense of Cuba prior to 1951.
Well, you know, my family was what in the United States would be middle class. Some people say we were privileged. I suppose in some sense we were, in the way that even in this country middle class people are privileged in comparison to the poor. Cuba was a country that was evolving. It had only been independent since 1902, independent from Spain. And it was in many ways still very closely tied to the United States. And one of the shocking facts many people don't realize is that before Fidel Castro came along in 1959, there were more Americans living in Cuba than Cubans living in the United States.
I had no clue about
Yes,
that.
it was, and as I grew up, until Fidel came along, American currency and Cuban currency were interchangeable. They were worth exactly the same. I used American coins and bills, and actually, as a matter of fact, one of my earliest memories is looking at a Jefferson nickel with Monticello on the back and saying to myself, what a nice building. I hope I go there someday. And I ended up teaching at the University of Virginia and visiting Monticello more times than I cared to.
What an interesting irony. One of the things that surprised me, Carlos, in reading this book, all your references to American television shows. You were very Americanized.
Most Cubans were. It was a nation that was emerging. It had problems. It had some serious problems. It had a long history throughout the entire first half of the 20th century of political corruption and of dictatorships and really bad politics. And yes, there was poverty. But what I often say when I go on speak to anyone about this book, when they ask me about poverty in Cuba, is I can compare Cuba to the place where I live now, New Haven, Connecticut. It's just about the same. The percentage of poor people to middle class people to upper class. There are cities in the United States right now that are actually worse economically than Cuba was. Cuba had the third highest per capita income in the Western Hemisphere. Number one was U.S., number two Canada, Cuba was third. It was not a destitute third world country, but that's the picture that Fidel Castro has painted to the world and everybody believes in. And it was not under control of the mafia. There's one movie I curse every time I think about, is Godfather Part 2, that scene where the mobsters are cutting this cake that has the map of Cuba on it, and they're dividing up Cuba. That has had such a powerful impact on the American imagination that it's when people talk to me about Cuba, it often comes up, oh, it was run by the mafia, wasn't it? And I have to say, it was corrupt, yes, it was corrupt, but it was also very violent. My entire childhood was filled with violence because Batista became president in '52. I was born in '50, and Fidel Castro took over in '59. My entire childhood was nothing but a period of violence and immense tension. But even under Batista, the dictator, whom I loathed as a child, there wasn't that kind of oppressive, totalitarian attempt to control everyone's thinking.
Well, I think that comes across so clearly in the book because Castro is overtaking the government. Wasn't just overtaking the government; it was overtaking the culture. He canceled Christmas, for goodness' sake.
They canceled Christmas, and it's still canceled.
And how were you able to reconcile that as a child with your personal belief system?
Well, my first thought when I was 8 years old when the change happened. Well, oh, this is good, and these guys are cool. They have beards, They have uniforms. They all carry guns. Oh, how wonderful, And as I point out in the book, we used to go up to the rebels when they first came to Havana and ask them for bullets. And actually, One time we asked them, could you give us one of your guns? Of course they wouldn't. That's why I thought it was very neat. But then within the first year, I began to feel like someone was trying to reach into my mind or my soul, or
even
both.
at that age.
Yes, and trying to tell me how to think and what to think. And the worst thing about a totalitarian regime is that it instantly divides people. If you're not 100% behind whatever the government wants, then instantly you're not a good citizen. Mm-hmm. Worse than that, you're not one of the people. You're instantly ostracized and turned into something else. So that, from the minute you say, I don't agree with the way things are being done, which we Americans are so fortunate to be able to say all the time,
Take it for granted.
If you simply disagree in public with anything that the government is doing, you could be in serious trouble, but you instantly become a non-citizen. So I felt I was no longer Cuban, because in all his speeches, Fidel kept talking about the Cuban people this, the Cuban people that. This is the revolution is for the people. And so, but I didn't agree with 100% of the things they were doing. I may have agreed with one or two things that seemed, as a child to me, they seemed kind of cool, like at our school we took collections to buy a tractor for poor peasants. And who would feel bad about that? Mm-hmm. I thought that was good, but other things began to feel like I wasn't Cuban. I felt like some alien within my own country.
It's frightening to think about. You capture so many of these sentiments and your own naivete in these opening paragraphs of your book, and I wonder if I could get you to read for us.
Sure, I'd love to. And this is the very first chapter, which when I sat down to write the book, I had no idea where I was going. This was the first thing I wrote. My academic books, I usually begin in the middle and work my way out. So this is how it came to me. The world changed while I slept, and much to my surprise, no one had consulted me. That's how it would always be from that day forward. Of course, that's the way it had been all along. I just didn't know it until that morning. Surprise upon surprise. Some good, some evil, most somewhere in between. And always without my consent. I was barely 8 years old, and I had spent hours dreaming of childish things, as children do. My father, who vividly remembered his prior incarnation as King Louis XVI of France, probably dreamt of costume balls, mobs, and guillotines. My mother, who had no memory of having been Marie Antoinette, couldn't have shared in his dreams. Maybe she dreamt of hibiscus blossoms and fine silk. Maybe she dreamt of angels, as she always encouraged me to do. Sueña con los angelitos, she would say. Dream of little angels. The fact that they were little meant they were too cute to be fallen angels. Devils can never be cute. The tropical sun knifed through the gaps in the wooden shutters, as always, extending in narrow shafts of light above my bed, revealing entire galaxies of swirling dust specks. I stared at the dust, as always, rapt. I don't remember getting out of bed, but I do remember walking into my parents' bedroom. Their shutters were open, and the room was flooded with light. As always, my father was putting on his trousers over his shoes. He always put on his socks and shoes first, and then his trousers. For years, I tried to duplicate that nearly magical feat with little success. The cuffs of my pants would always get stuck on my shoes, and no amount of tugging could free them. More than once, I risked an eternity in hell and spit out swear words. I had no idea that if your pants are baggy enough, you can slide them over anything, even snowshoes. All I knew then was that I couldn't be like my father. As he slid his baggy trousers over his brown wingtip shoes effortlessly, Louis XVI broke the news to me. Batista is gone. He flew out of Havana early this morning. It looks like the rebels have won. You lie, I said. No, I swear it's true, he replied. Marie Antoinette, my mother, assured me it was true as she applied lipstick seated at her vanity table. It was a beautiful piece of mahogany furniture with 3 mirrors, one flat against the wall and 2 on either side of that, hinged so that their angles could be changed at will. I used to turn the side mirrors so they would face each other and create infinite regressions of one another. Sometimes I would peer and plunge into infinity. "You'd better stay indoors today," my mother said. "God knows what could happen. Don't even stick your head out the door." Maybe she too had dreamt of guillotines after all. Or maybe it was just sensible motherly advice. Perhaps she knew that the heads of the elites don't usually fare well on the street when revolutions triumph, not even when the heads belong to children. That was the first day of January, 1959.
You write so eloquently, it's hard to imagine you're ever at a loss for words. But were there times when you were overwhelmed by the magnitude of this story and the magnitude of Cuba's story?
Throughout my life I have been, but what happened is that I suppressed everything. You know, from the minute I got to the United States, I put all that behind me. Even as a child, I knew that the way to survive was to put it all behind me. But this is one of the few benefits of aging. It's that, you know, as you mature, you have to come to terms with who you are, right? And you have to come to terms with your past. And actually, this was my moment of awakening to my own past.
Of course, your parents figure prominently throughout the book. Did your father really believe he was the reincarnation of Louis
Yes, he did.
XVI?
And this is something that is not very well known, and it's a very interesting fact. The American Theosophical Society, it's not a church, it's really a religion that is based mostly on Hinduism. The American Theosophical Society sent missionaries to the world. Their most successful mission was Cuba. And there were thousands and thousands of people in Cuba at the turn of the century, right after the Spanish-American War, who got hooked on theosophy, which teaches reincarnation. But they not only teach reincarnation, they also believe that you can remember your past lives. Well, Shirley MacLaine, for instance, Shirley MacLaine, who wrote a book about all her past lives.
She had several lives, yeah.
And she remembers them all in detail. So my father knew, he wasn't convinced, he knew he was Louis XVI and claims he could remember his life. Oddly enough, you know, the whole family was also a reincarnation of the French royal family, except for me.
And tell us about you.
Well, I don't know. I never found out who I had been. My father never told me, said I wasn't ready to hear it.
Have you wondered in years since? Have you speculated?
Yeah, I think probably it was something bad. Maybe I was Judas or something. I don't know. Why wouldn't he tell me?
Well, I would wonder. That would certainly haunt me. Maybe you'll discover that in the process of writing your follow-up book to this, if you ever do write one. You mentioned being evacuated to the United States. You and was it 12,000, 14,000?
14,000 children.
Children airlifted from Cuba to the United States. And your parents made that decision. It must have been heart-wrenching for them.
Now I realize how heart-wrenching it must have been. Of course, as a child and even as a young adult. Until I had children of my own, I couldn't appreciate what they did. And another amazing fact, you know, in October of 1962, missile crisis, the door closed. This is why I was stuck in the U.S. and my parents were stuck in Cuba. This happened to over 10,000 of the 14,000 children. Parents were trapped. But even more amazing, if the door hadn't closed, there were between 80 to 100,000 children ready to leave. You know, children whose parents were willingly sending them to another country where they knew no one and had no relatives, just to get them out. Of course, every parent who did this thought it was a temporary thing. They thought the situation would change very quickly in Cuba. But in the back of everyone's mind, I realize now, the back of every parent, it's the thought, maybe I'll never see them again. Yeah.
Well, in fact, you and your brother were separated.
Yes. The minute we arrived in the U.S., we were separated. He went to one camp and I went to a different camp. Then he was sent to one foster family and I was sent to a different foster family. And it happened to all 14,000. Sometimes they would send a whole cluster of kids to a special place like an orphanage or a boarding school. But that was not true for everyone. I know of 7 kids who were sent to an orphanage in New Orleans. One of those children is now the U.S. ambassador to Spain. But he saw terrible things and lived through terrible things in that orphanage. I happened to end up with a wonderful foster family, the Chates, in Miami. But I was only with them for 9 months. Then we got reshuffled, and then my brother and I were brought back together again, which was good. But the bad news is that we were in a home for juvenile delinquents.
Did you pick up
Where we
anything?
picked up all sorts of things. And my brother and I were actually once roughed up because we wouldn't go steal an outboard motor that this guy wanted us to help him steal. So I learned a lot there, and so did my brother.
I imagine so, and great survival skills, to say the least. What did America represent to you and your family at that time?
Well, you know, when I got to the U.S., that very first night I was here, I thought I had gone from one world to another, actually like one planet to another. I felt I was on a different planet. And of course I felt that I had left behind a horrible place, and had come to a place where I know I didn't expect it to be a picnic. I expected it to be really hard. But I knew that I could think whatever I wanted to think and say whatever I wanted to say. And even as an 11-year-old, that mattered a lot to me. And I went from being a middle-class kid to being at the very bottom of the social scale, the absolute bottom. I did not mind that one bit. You know, at this home for juvenile delinquents, we only got one meal a day, and we were basically always hungry and starving. I was happy to be here.
Simply because you had the freedom to think.
To think and to be whoever I wanted to be.
President Kennedy was assassinated shortly after you got to this country. Were you able to separate that tragedy from the political strife you had known in Cuba, or did you just think that's what happens with governments?
I was so used to violence that it did not surprise me. Not in one bit. And I was, at the time, I was convinced it must, of course, you know, being a child, it must have been Fidel Castro behind the whole thing. It doesn't matter, well, some of the conspiracy theories point the finger to Fidel, and who knows. But I wasn't the least bit surprised. I thought, gee, I'm living through a historical moment. But it didn't strike me as odd. And then 5 years later, when we had that whole rash of assassinations, Martin Luther King Jr., Bobby Kennedy, and then all the riots and so, I thought that's just the way life is.
At what point were you reconciled with your family?
My mom tried for 3.5 years to leave, and the Cuban government put all sorts of obstacles in the way. She finally left in 1965. My brother and I had left in 62. So 3.5 years later, we were reunited with our mom in Chicago, because that's where she was sent to Chicago. The Cuban Refugee Center in Miami would normally send refugees to other states because Miami couldn't take all this new population. So we ended up in Chicago with our mom, and our dad never got out. We never saw him again.
And you write that it was really awkward with your mom at first because things had changed so much in the family dynamic.
Yes.
You changed physically, emotionally. You didn't need her anymore.
And not only that, you know, most teenagers don't want their parents to take care of them anymore, but they have this ambivalence about it. I noticed that with my own kids. But in my brother's case and mine, we had grown accustomed to being entirely in control of our lives and making all our own decisions.
You being your own parents.
Right. And the tables turned because our mom couldn't find a job, and my brother and I had to go work full-time just to make ends meet. And it took my mom a long time to find a job, and when she finally found one, it was minimum wage, which meant that my brother and I kept working. My brother kept working full-time, even though he hadn't finished high school yet. I worked full-time my whole freshman year in high school. I worked from 4 in the afternoon to 1 in the morning, and then went to school for my entire freshman year. But when my mom finally got a job, I got a part-time job and worked only 30 hours a week, and made more money working part-time than my mom made making full-time. And it's very, I realize now, I have teenage kids, you know, how weird that was by American standards. And it felt weird. It definitely felt like there was something not quite wrong with this picture, you know. I'm still kind of a child, and my brother and I are taking care of our mom, who was, you know, she's our mom. We loved her.
Sure.
She did wonderful things for us. She cooked and did whatever she could, cleaned, and was concerned, but she really could not be part of our lives because she knew no English. I could have brought home everything from school. I could have been failing all my courses and shown it to her and said, you know, an F is the best grade in the United States. I know, I have friends who did that. You know. And I have one friend actually who was suspended from school and brought home the note and said, look, I want a prize. And the prize is so good I don't have to go to school for 2 weeks. And his parents believed him. So
he was expelled? Or
he was suspended for 2 weeks.
We just have a few seconds left here, Carlos. What did you learn about yourself from writing this memoir?
I learned that we all carry conflicting thoughts and conflicting impulses within us, and that that doesn't make us schizoid. You know, that we can love and hate something at the very same time, and that when it comes to memory, we remember that something was painful. We remember something was joyful. We can't really tap into the pain and the joy, but you can realize that that's who you are, and you realize that you are a bundle of responses to your own history.
Carlos, thanks so much for being here. Congratulations on Waiting for Snow in Havana, and thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.